Frank pulled the folded newspaper from his jacket pocket, tossing it onto the diner counter. Its headline, smeared with last week's mud, screamed Miller Farm facing foreclosure. He looked at me, then at the scattered regulars. "Tell them, Helen," he said, his voice flat, "how you've helped us into this mess." My cheeks burned. Peggy Sue Jensen stopped stirring her coffee. Helen Miller faces public humiliation from her husband Frank at the local diner. The town's gossip, Peggy Sue Jensen, observes the scene with keen interest. Helen walks home through the cold, feeling the weight of the town's scrutiny. She reflects on her stagnant marriage to Frank and their worsening financial plight. The Miller farm, once a source of pride, now symbolizes their fading hopes. Her daughter, Grace Miller, is growing up amidst their quiet, constant tension. Helen's thoughts drift to past relationships with Dale Hansen and Clint Olson. She feels trapped by her circumstances, longing for a different kind of life. A phone call from her sister, Martha Hayes, offers a brief, strained connection. Martha's advice, though well-intentioned, highlights Helen's perceived failures. Frank's coldness and resentment have become a permanent fixture in their home. Helen struggles with the burden of her choices and the expectations of a small town. The future looms, uncertain and heavy, marked by the inevitable changes ahead. The diner air thickened around me, heavy with the smell of old coffee and Frank's words. My face felt hot, a flush creeping up my neck, as if I had been caught doing something shameful. Peggy Sue Jensen, whose table sat closest to the counter, simply watched. Her spoon, momentarily still, scraped the ceramic bowl as she resumed stirring. Frank offered no further explanation. He just stood there, his hands shoved deep into his pockets, letting the silence do its work. I picked up the crumpled newspaper, careful not to touch his fingers, and tucked it under my arm. "We'll talk about this at home," I said, my voice low and steady, a skill I had learned over years of practice. It was not a request. It was a statement. He merely grunted, a sound that meant both agreement and dismissal. Turning from the counter, I walked past the other patrons, past the booths where men in work coats nursed their morning coffee. No one met my eye, but I felt their gazes like pinpricks on my back. Outside, the late November air bit at my exposed skin. It was a sharp, clean cold, the kind that promised snow. I pulled my worn wool coat tighter, the fabric thin against the wind. Elmwood Creek was a town built on shared knowledge, a place where everyone knew your business, or thought they did. A headline about foreclosure on the Miller farm was not news to anyone. What Frank did inside, however, was a public confirmation of our troubles, a declaration of where he placed the blame. The walk home was a mile of gravel road and bare fields. Our house stood low and white, a small sentinel against the woody, flat landscape. Grace would be home from school by now, probably doing her homework at the kitchen table. She was 12, a quiet girl with her father's eyes and my tendency to look away when things got too loud. I often wondered what she absorbed from the air between Frank and me, the unspoken words that filled our small rooms. Frank and I had built this life on a handshake and a promise. He was a Miller, and the Miller farm had been in his family for 3 generations. When we married, it felt like joining something solid, rooted in the land. But the land had been stubborn lately. The corn yields were down, the tractor always needed repair, and the bank statements grew thinner with each passing month. His resentment, a slow burn, had started to spread. It touched everything, especially me. Sometimes late at night, I would lie awake listening to Frank's even breathing beside me, and my mind would wander. It would go back to Dale Hansen, who had promised me open roads and a life away from this predictable flatland. Or to Clint Olson with his quick laugh and his plans to open a garage in the city. Those were choices I had made, roads not taken. Frank was the reliable one, my mother had said. He was steady. "You need a steady man, Helen." The house was quiet when I entered. Grace sat at the kitchen table, a textbook open before her. She looked up, her expression a mix of curiosity and caution. "Dad was at the diner," she said, her voice soft. I nodded, hanging my coat on the peg by the door. "He was," I replied, pulling out a chair. The words were flat, carrying no information. It was enough. She went back to her book. Later, the phone rang. It was Martha, my older sister, her voice always carrying a slight edge of concern. "Heard you two made a scene at the diner," she said without preamble. Martha rarely minced words. She worked at the county records office. Nothing escaped her notice. Frank's upset about the farm, I told her, stating the obvious. Well, what did you expect, Helen? It's a bad year. You should have kept a tighter rein on things. Martha always thought I could control Frank, or at least the outcome of our lives. She meant well. You're still young, she said, a familiar refrain. You need a reliable man. The irony was not lost on me. I had one. Frank came in an hour later, tracking mud onto the linoleum. He peeled off his work gloves, dropping them by the door without a word. Dinner was silent, punctuated only by the clinking of forks against plates. Grace picked at her food, sensing the heavy air. After she went to bed, Frank sat in his armchair, staring at the muted television screen. I washed the dishes, the hot water a small comfort on my hands. The newspaper still lay on the counter, the headline screaming. It felt like a trap, built piece by piece, and I was firmly inside it. Frank finds a shocking photograph of a younger Helen with 5 shirtless men. He confronts Helen, accusing her of having a hidden, adventurous past. Helen feels a deep flush of shame and struggles to remember the reckless night. She tries to dismiss the photo as from a stupid party and not what it seems. Frank's sarcasm cuts deep, questioning her sincerity about their marriage. Helen defends her past, arguing it happened before their wedding. Frank reveals journal entries dated during their engagement, deepening the betrayal. He struggles to articulate his pain, hinting at her infidelity during their planning. Helen admits to mistakes but questions why Frank is digging into her past. Frank states he was looking for tax returns and instead found evidence of a lie. Helen dismisses a single journal as insignificant compared to their 32-year marriage. Frank reveals there are 3 more journals, escalating the accusation. His tone is full of suspicion, wondering about the extent of her hidden past. The weight of his questions hangs heavy, threatening to unravel their life together. The next evening, the silence in our living room was different. It wasn't the usual comfortable quiet of a long-married couple. This was charged, heavy, like the air before a summer storm. Frank sat in his armchair, not watching the television, but staring at a cardboard box on the floor between his feet. He had been down in the basement all afternoon, ostensibly looking for old tax records. He reached into the box, his movements deliberate, and pulled out a tattered manila envelope. The paper was worn soft at the edges, creased from years of being tucked away. He extracted something from it, something flat and rectangular. He held it between his thumb and forefinger, not looking at it, but at me. I was sitting on the sofa trying to read a magazine, but the words blurred. I felt my stomach clench. And I suppose this doesn't matter either, he said, his voice quiet, almost a whisper, but it sliced through the silence like glass. He leaned forward, thrusting the image at me. It was a photograph, a younger Helen, wild-haired and laughing, surrounded by 5 shirtless men. Their arms were thrown around each other, bottles clutched in their hands. Beneath the faded image, in a familiar looping script, were the words, "Unforgettable night with the boys from the old tech school." The handwriting was mine. A wave of heat washed over me, not just shame, but a profound, sickening surprise. I had completely forgotten that night, a blur of cheap beer and loud music from before I knew Frank. Or so I thought. My mind raced, trying to place it. Had it really been before? That was just a stupid party, I faltered, the words catching in my throat. My eyes flickered up to his, then down to the photo. It wasn't what it looks like, really. Frank's mouth twisted, a sarcastic smile that didn't reach his eyes. Oh no, because it looks an awful lot like my wife had quite the adventurous past she never bothered to mention. He held the photo up, tilting it slightly as if to examine it closer. Everyone has a past, Frank, I said, trying to steady my voice. You can't hold something against me that happened before we were married. We were young. He didn't reply directly. Instead, he reached back into the box, pulling out a small, leather-bound journal. It was one of mine, a diary I had kept for a few years after high school. My face grew even hotter. He let it fall open, his eyes scanning the pages. Some of these entries are dated during our engagement, Helen, he said, his voice trembling now, the quiet anger giving way to something raw. He shoved the journal back into the box, his hands shaking. While I was planning our wedding, getting ready to settle down. You were—" He couldn't finish the sentence. The words hung in the air, unfinished but understood. I looked at my hands, clasped tight in my lap. I made mistakes, Frank. Everyone does, but that was a lifetime ago. Why are you digging this up now? My voice was barely audible. The shame was a bitter taste. He stared at me, his gaze cold and distant, as if I were a stranger. I was looking for tax returns, for the farm. Instead, I found evidence our entire marriage might be based on a lie. His eyes were hard, unblinking. I scoffed, a short, sharp sound that was half breath, half disbelief. That's ridiculous. One journal doesn't invalidate 32 years, Frank. 32 years of raising a family, working this farm. What kind of sense does that make? Frank's eyes narrowed, a glint of something I hadn't seen in years. One journal, he repeated, his voice rising slightly. There are 3 more in that box, Helen. 3. He gestured vaguely towards the box with his chin. How many were there? 10? 20? The accusation hung in the still air, heavy and poisonous. He didn't wait for an answer. He just sat there looking at me, waiting for me to break. Frank tells Helen he wants her out of the house, his voice frighteningly calm. Helen is stunned, protesting that it is her home as well. Frank turns away, making it clear his decision is final. He tells her to go to Martha's or another sister's, stating he can't bear to look at her. Helen protests, calling him insane and accusing him of overreacting. Frank whirls back, his eyes blazing, questioning her understanding of his betrayal. Helen insists her past wasn't a secret, but simply no longer relevant. Frank laughs bitterly, revealing entries about her sleeping with other men during their engagement. He mentions her referring to him as the safe choice while loving someone else. Tears sting Helen's eyes, but she fights to hold them back, asserting her choice of Frank. She states her faithfulness throughout their marriage, challenging his doubt. Frank questions her fidelity, admitting he no longer knows what to believe. Helen firmly reiterates that she never cheated after they were married. Frank repeats his demand for her to leave, needing time alone. The air in the living room grew colder, even though the furnace hummed steadily in the basement. Frank's gaze was fixed on the cardboard box, not on me. He took a deep breath, and then the words came out, flat and chilling. I want you out of this house. I blinked, trying to process what he had said. The words hung in the air, heavy and solid. What? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. You can't just throw me out. This is my home too. We built this life together. My hand instinctively went to my chest as if to ward off a blow. He didn't turn to face me. He simply reached into the box and stuffed the journal back, his movements precise, deliberate. Not anymore, he said, his voice frighteningly calm. It was a finality that scared me more than any shout. Go to Martha's or your sister's. I don't care, I just can't look at you. Anger, hot and sharp, began to push past the fear. This is insane, Frank, I said, my voice rising. You're overreacting. You find some old journals, a stupid photograph, and suddenly our entire life means nothing? He whirled around then, his eyes blazing, the calm facade shattering. Am I overreacting? He challenged, taking a step towards me. Do you know what it feels like to discover your entire life might be a fabrication? To realize the person you have been married to for 3 decades was someone else entirely when you met them, and you never even knew it. His hands were clenched into fists at his sides. It wasn't a secret, I insisted, trying to stand my ground. It just wasn't relevant anymore. It was years ago. He let out a short, bitter laugh, a sound devoid of humor. Not relevant. You wrote about sleeping with other men while we were engaged, Helen, while I was picking out rings and talking to your father about our future. He paused, letting that sink in. You referred to me as the safe choice while you were in love with someone else. How is that not relevant? My vision blurred, tears pricked at the corners of my eyes, but I refused to let them fall. Not now, not in front of him. People change, Frank, I said, my voice tight. I changed. I chose you, Frank. I chose this life. I chose our family. I took a breath, the words coming out in a rush. I've been faithful to you for our entire marriage. He looked at me, doubt seeping into his eyes, mixing with the anger. Have you? He questioned, his voice lower now. almost speculative. Right now, Helen, I don't know what to believe. The accusation hung between us, heavier than any physical blow. I have never cheated on you after we got married, I stated firmly, my gaze unwavering. It was the truth, the one solid thing I held on to. The past was messy, regrettable, but our marriage had been built on fidelity, at least on my part, since the day we said our vows. Frank simply shook his head, a gesture of profound weariness. He turned his back to me again, facing the silent, dark television screen. "Get out," he repeated, his voice flat, exhausted. "Pack a bag and leave. I need time." The finality of his tone was absolute. The conversation was over. There would be no more arguments, no more explanations. Only the raw, cold demand. Helen stands frozen, a maelstrom of emotions swirling within her. She realizes that further words are useless and turns to descend the stairs. In the bedroom, she mechanically packs a suitcase, her mind numb from shock. She catches sight of their wedding photograph, but refrains from taking it. Frank remains in the living room, clutching the journal as a weapon. Helen asserts that this isn't over, and they will talk once he calms down. Frank offers no response, his expression an unreadable, impenetrable wall. Helen, desperate, declares her love for him, affirming it's never been a lie. Still met with silence, she steps outside, the door closing with a definitive click. News of their separation spreads rapidly through the small town of Elmwood Creek. By nightfall, Helen's phone is overwhelmed with messages and inquiries. Peggy Sue Jensen texts, confirming Frank is openly discussing their split at Gus's tavern. Helen collapses onto the bed in Martha's guest room, horrified by the public humiliation. She realizes Frank is deliberately airing their private agony to punish her. She confides in Martha, who tries to console her about men's irrationality. Martha advises her to give Frank time to cool down and process his emotions. Helen, however, doubts reconciliation, recalling the absolute disillusionment in Frank's eyes. I stood rooted to the spot, the echo of Frank's words ringing in my ears. A war raged inside me. Anger, disbelief, a desperate sadness. But I knew with a certainty that settled cold in my gut that no words I offered now would change anything. His decision was made. For tonight, at least. I turned slowly, my back to him, and descended the stairs, each step heavy with the weight of unspoken grief and a future that felt suddenly unmoored. The house was too quiet, holding its breath. Grace was upstairs, undoubtedly doing her homework, oblivious to the silent earthquake that had just rocked her parents' world. I swallowed the lump in my throat, grateful she hadn't witnessed this particular scene. In our bedroom, the room we had shared for 32 years, I moved mechanically. I pulled a worn suitcase from the closet shelf and began to pack. My mind felt numb, detached from my hands as they folded clothes. A few shirts, a pair of jeans, a sweater. My gaze swept over the dresser, lingering for a moment on our wedding photo. A younger Frank, awkward in his suit, and me, radiant in my mother's lace dress. I almost reached for it, then stopped myself. It felt like a relic from a different life, a different couple. I zipped the suitcase. Frank was still in the living room when I walked past, standing by the mantelpiece. The journal still clutched in his hand like a weapon. He hadn't moved. "This isn't over, Frank," I said, my voice trembling despite my effort to keep it steady. "You'll calm down and we'll talk. We have to." He said nothing. His expression was unreadable. A wall had descended between us, solid and unyielding. "I love you, Frank," I added, the words desperate, ragged. That's never been a lie. Still silence. Not even a flicker in his eyes. He just stood there, a statue carved from resentment and betrayal. I waited a moment longer, hoping for any sign, any response, but there was none. I turned and walked to the front door, the suitcase heavy in my hand. The door clicked shut behind me, a quiet final judgment. The night air was crisp and dark. I got into my old sedan, the engine turning over with a familiar groan, and drove the few miles to Martha's house. I didn't cry. There was no room for tears. Only a dull, aching void. The news spread through Elmwood Creek like wildfire. By the time I had helped Martha with her evening chores and settled into her guest room, my phone, usually quiet, was bombarded. Texts popped up, one after another. "Is it true you and Frank split? This one from Peggy Sue Jensen, always too nosy, always the first to know. Then another, heard Frank at Gus's Tavern, Helen, he's telling everyone. My blood ran cold. Frank was publicly humiliating me. He was airing our private agony, our deepest wounds, us for the entire town to dissect and discuss over their beers and coffees. It was a calculated act, a deliberate cruelty. I sank onto the guest bed, a sense of horror washing over me. He's doing this to punish me, I whispered to Martha, who was sitting on the edge of the bed, her face etched with concern. Martha reached out, her hand gently touching my arm. Men act irrationally when they're wounded, Helen, she said softly. Give him time. He'll cool down. But I wasn't so sure. I kept seeing the absolute disillusionment in Frank's eyes, the way he had looked at me as if I were a stranger. A lie made flesh. This felt like more than a temporary fit of anger. This felt like a beginning or an end to something I had always considered unshakable. Grace, Helen's daughter, calls, her voice tight with anger and accusation. Grace reveals her father, Frank, called her in tears, recounting Helen's past. Helen's heart sinks, anticipating the painful, inevitable confrontation. She tries to explain to Grace about old journals discovered by Frank. Grace interrupts, stating Frank sent her photos of specific journal pages. Grace bitterly accuses Helen of sleeping with 5 different men while engaged to Frank. The accusation feels like a physical blow, leaving Helen stunned and shamed. Helen attempts to defend herself, citing youth and confusion as her reasons. Grace dismisses being young as an inadequate excuse, highlighting Helen's hypocrisy. Grace reminds Helen of her own lectures on honesty and commitment. The daughter questions her mother's integrity, asking how she could be so deceptive. Grace then asks if Helen truly called Frank the safe choice in her writings. Helen's throat tightens, the echo of Frank's earlier pain now reverberating through her daughter's words. Despite the overwhelming guilt, Helen insists on her enduring love for Frank, finally succumbing to tears. Later that evening, the phone rang, startling me from the uneasy quiet of Martha's guest room. The caller ID showed Grace. My stomach dropped. I knew this call was coming, yet I dreaded it more than anything Frank had thrown at me. He had gone to Gus's. He would have called here. Mom? Grace's voice was tight, strained, laced with an anger I rarely heard from her. What the hell is going on? Dad just called me in tears. I closed my eyes, a silent prayer escaping my lips. There was no gentle way to explain this. Sweetheart, I began, trying to keep my voice steady. Your father found some old journals of mine from before we were married. He's upset about some. He showed me, Mom, Grace interrupted, cutting me off sharply. Her voice was colder now, edged with disdain. He sent me photos of pages from your journal. There was a pause, a breath held taut. You wrote about sleeping with 5 different men in 1 week while you were engaged to Dad. The accusation felt like a slap across the face, sharp and stinging. My cheeks burned, even though I was alone in the room with Martha, who sat across from me, her face pale. I could almost see the images Frank had chosen, the words he had highlighted. He had made sure to select the most damning parts. How could you do that to him? Grace's voice was raw with betrayal. To Dad? To us? It wasn't. I was young and confused, Grace, I stammered, scrambling for words. It was a different time. I was trying to figure things out. The excuses sounded hollow even to my own ears. That's your excuse? Being young? Grace scoffed, the sound cutting deep. You've always preached about honesty and commitment, about making your bed and lying in it. How could you have been so hypocritical? Her words were like daggers, twisting in an already open wound. She was right. I had preached those things, lived by them, or so I thought. But the past, once buried, had clawed its way back, exposing the fragile foundations of my own convictions. It makes you wonder how many choices are truly behind you, doesn't it? Stick around to the end to see how life's costly choices unfold. Dad said you called him the safe choice. Grace continued, her voice softer now, but no less hurtful. Is that true? My throat tightened. The words echoed the hurt Frank had felt, the wound I had inflicted, now amplified through our daughter. I loved your father, Grace, I insisted. the carefully constructed dam finally breaking. Tears, hot and abundant, streamed down my face. I did then, and I do now. That was never a lie. But even as I spoke the words, I wondered if they were enough. Could the truth of my current feelings ever erase the brutal honesty of my younger self, captured in faded ink, now weaponized against me? Grace was silent on the other end, breathing shallowly. The connection felt thin, stretched to its breaking point. Grace's voice turns cold, expressing profound disillusionment with her mother. She tells Helen that Frank is heartbroken, feeling his entire life was a lie. Helen attempts to explain her past mistakes, citing youth and societal pressures. She insists she chose Frank willingly and never regretted that decision. Grace demands to know if Helen ever disclosed her past to Frank. Helen admits she never did, believing it to be irrelevant and long forgotten. Grace counters that it clearly mattered to Frank, and it matters now. The call abruptly ends, leaving Helen burdened by her daughter's crushing disappointment. Days turn into weeks, with Frank remaining silent and unreachable. Helen's attempts to contact him through calls and texts go unanswered. Martha advises patience, believing Frank needs space to process. Helen, however, understands Frank's silence is indicative of a deep, festering wound. One afternoon, a letter arrives, not from Frank, but from his lawyer. It is a summons for a legal separation, citing irreconcilable differences. The summons also demands full disclosure of all financial assets. Helen is struck by a fresh wave of panic, realizing the severe implications for her future. Grace's silence on the phone stretched, heavy and accusing. Then her voice returned, colder than I had ever heard it. It was devoid of the warmth I had known my entire life. "I don't know who you are, Mom," she said, each word precise, cutting. My breath hitched. "Grace, please," I pleaded, but she wasn't listening. "Dad is heartbroken," she continued, ignoring my plea. "He said he feels like his whole life was a lie. He said everything he thought was real, about you, about us, is just broken." I tried again to explain, to make her understand the complexities of youth, the pressure to conform, the lack of wisdom that comes with experience. "I made mistakes, yes," I confessed, my voice raw. "I was young, I was foolish. There were expectations, things I thought I needed to prove to myself, to others. But I made a choice, Grace, to be with your father, and I never regretted it. Never." "Did you ever tell him any of this?" Grace demanded, her tone sharp. "Any of it? About the men? About calling him the safe choice?" I swallowed, my throat dry. The truth was a bitter pill. "No," I admitted, my voice barely a whisper. "I never did. I thought it was in the past. It didn't matter anymore. It was before." "It mattered to him, Mom," Grace said, her voice rising now, close to tears herself. "It clearly matters now." And then with a click, the line went dead. She had hung up. I sat there, the phone still pressed to my ear, listening to the dial tone. The crushing weight of my daughter's disappointment settled over me, heavier than anything Frank had said. I had lost her too. Days blurred into a week, then two. Frank remained silent, unreachable. I tried calling, texting, leaving messages on his voicemail, trying to sound calm, rational, but there was never a response. Just the silence. It became a constant companion, a dull ache in my chest. Martha, bless her, tried to be comforting. "He needs space, Helen," she'd say, patting my hand. "He'll come around. Just give him time." But I knew Frank. This silence was not just anger. This was different. This was the deep wound of betrayal, festering. He was a man who held grudges like they were family heirlooms, polishing them in his mind until they gleamed with righteous indignation. This wasn't something that would simply come around. One afternoon, a letter arrived for me at Martha's house. It wasn't from Frank. It was from his lawyer, a well-known local attorney named Mr. Henderson, whose office overlooked the town square. The envelope felt stiff, formal. I opened it with trembling fingers. Inside was a summons, a petition for legal separation. The word blurred on the page, but the phrase irreconcilable differences stood out, stark and cold. And then a paragraph demanding full disclosure of all financial assets, bank accounts, property deeds, investments. A fresh wave of panic washed over me. This wasn't just about emotions anymore. This was about property. about money. This was about my future, about everything I thought I had built. This was real. Helen meets with her lawyer, Mrs. Peterson, a kind older woman. Mrs. Peterson explains the journals could be used for character assassination, affecting the settlement. Helen whispers in horror that Frank wants to ruin her. Mrs. Peterson reveals Frank is seeking the house and most assets, citing emotional distress. Helen is aghast, protesting her shared contributions to their life and assets. Mrs. Peterson warns that Frank may argue Helen concealed a significant part of her past. Helen remembers the incriminating photo and the safe choice journal entries. She realizes Frank is fighting against not just physical, but emotional deceit. Frank's lawyer files a motion for a temporary restraining order, barring Helen from their home. Helen feels utterly exposed, watching her life publicly unravel in court documents. She understands Frank seeks retribution, not merely a separation. Guilt over her past indiscretions returns, heavier and more oppressive. A terrifying thought emerges. Frank might use his discovery to question Grace's paternity. A new profound fear grips Helen, envisioning the complete loss of everything she holds dear. The following week, I found myself in the small, unassuming office of Mrs. Peterson, a kind older woman with sensible glasses and a reassuring, if slightly weary, smile. She had handled many divorces in Elmwood Creek over the years, navigating the quiet complexities of small-town relationships. Her office smelled faintly of old paper and dust. I pushed the separation papers across her polished wooden desk. Mrs. Peterson read through them slowly, her brow furrowed. "Mr. Miller is asking for a substantial portion of the marital assets," she said without looking up. "And his lawyer is indicating he intends to use these journals and photographs as evidence of, well, character." She finally looked at me, her gaze soft but direct. "Character assassination, Helen. It could affect the settlement." "He wants to ruin me," I whispered, the realization chilling me to the bone. It wasn't just about anger anymore. It was about tearing down everything I was. Mrs. Peterson nodded grimly. "Frank is asking for the house and most of the assets, Helen, the farm, the savings, and he's claiming emotional distress due to perceived deception throughout the marriage." "But we built that life together," I protested, my voice rising in disbelief. "I contributed to everything. I worked on the farm. I raised Grace. I managed the house. That farm was our life, not just his." "I understand," Mrs. Peterson said, raising a hand gently. "But Mr. Miller's lawyer will argue that your historical actions, as documented in these journals, indicate a pattern of deceit, an intentional withholding of crucial information that would have impacted his decision to marry you and therefore his investment into the marriage." She paused. "He might use the journals to argue you hid a significant part of your past, leading to emotional distress that warrants a larger share of the assets." Only I remembered the photograph, the entries about the safe choice. It wasn't just physical infidelity Frank was fighting against. It was the deeper, more insidious wound of emotional deceit, the feeling that his choice had been manipulated, his trust betrayed at its core. The next piece of news from Mrs. Peterson hit harder. "Mr. Henderson has also filed a motion for a temporary restraining order," she said, her voice softer this time, as if cushioning a blow, "preventing you from entering the house or accessing any joint accounts without court order." My breath caught in my throat. I couldn't go home. My own house, the place where Grace was. I felt completely exposed. My life, my privacy, unraveling in public court documents for anyone in the courthouse to read. It wasn't just about my past now, it was about stripping away my present, my dignity. I realized then that Frank wasn't just seeking separation. He wasn't just asking for time. He wanted retribution. He wanted to punish me. The guilt over my past indiscretions, those fleeting moments of youthful recklessness, returned heavier than ever. They were not just mistakes anymore. They were ammunition. Then a new terrifying fear gripped me, cold and sharp. If he was willing to expose everything, to dissect my character in court, to claim emotional distress due to perceived deceit, what else might he do? What if he used his discovery to question Grace's paternity? The thought, ugly and unthinkable, lodged itself in my mind. Losing everything, my home, my financial security, My standing in the community was one thing. Losing Grace, or her respect, or dragging her into this vicious fight was another. A truly terrifying fear. Helen spends lonely nights at Martha's reflecting on her past. She rereads old letters, connecting with her younger, reckless self. Thoughts drift to Dale Hansen and Clint Olson, figures from decades ago. She questions if her past actions were worth the current pain, concluding they were not. Helen calls Grace again, but is met with her daughter's cold, distant voicemail. She leaves a message, pleading for understanding and admitting her mistakes, but finds no solace. The relentless town whispers reach her through subtle glances and averted eyes. Her reputation, painstakingly built over 3 decades, is now in ruins. She acknowledges Frank's reaction stemmed from a profound betrayal, not overreaction. The long-buried weight of her past actions has finally surfaced. Helen contemplates confronting Frank directly, but struggles to find adequate words. She feels "I'm sorry" is utterly insufficient for the depth of the damage. Helen gazes out at the quiet, familiar streets of Elmwood Creek. Her old life is irrevocably gone, a casualty of a secret too long held. The future ahead is empty and uncertain, burdened by the heavy price of her past. She realizes some secrets inevitably resurface, waiting for the opportune moment to erupt. The nights at Martha's were long and solitary. I spent them mostly in the guest room, curled on the bed, staring at the ceiling, or sometimes sorting through an old shoebox of letters Martha had found, letters from high school friends, faded postcards, and a few scribbled notes from Dale Hansen and Clint Olson. Names I hadn't thought of in decades, names now charged with a bitter significance. I reread some of them, seeing a younger, wilder Helen, full of longing for something more than what Elmwood Creek offered. She was reckless, yes, seeking validation in transient affections, impatient with the slow, steady rhythm of small-town life. But was she worth this pain? The pain I was causing Frank? The agony Grace was feeling? The quiet shame that followed me everywhere? The answer now was a resounding no. Those moments, those fleeting desires, were not worth the wreckage they had brought. I called Grace again. Her voicemail was cold, distant, a pre-recorded message that offered no comfort. "You've reached Grace Miller. I'm probably busy. Leave a message." There was no warmth, no hint of the daughter I knew. I left a message anyway, my voice thick with unshed tears. I pleaded for understanding, admitted my mistakes, tried to explain the complexities of youth, but the words felt hollow, inadequate. The silence after the beep was deafening. There was no peace to be found in my own voice. The town whispers were relentless. Even staying mostly at Martha's, they reached me. In the rare trips to the grocery store, I felt the glances, saw the averted eyes. Peggy Sue Jensen offered a tight-lipped smile that didn't reach her eyes, a kind of pity mixed with satisfaction. My reputation, carefully built over 3 decades as Frank Miller's steady wife, Grace's devoted mother, a pillar of the community, was in tatters. I knew now Frank wasn't overreacting. He was reacting to a profound betrayal, a carefully constructed lie that had underpinned his entire adult life. My past actions, long buried under years of marriage and domesticity, had finally surfaced, an unavoidable weight. The burden of those choices was heavy, crushing. I contemplated reaching out to Frank directly, bypassing the lawyers. But what could I possibly say? "I'm sorry" felt insufficient for the damage done, for the decades of assumed trust that had crumbled around him. How do you apologize for a fundamental deception, for a past that was not merely forgotten, but actively concealed? I looked out the window at the quiet, tree-lined streets of Elmwood Creek, the familiar houses, the aging cars. My old life was gone, a casualty of a secret kept too long, a truth that had festered beneath the surface. The future stretched before me, empty and uncertain, marked by the heavy price of my past. It was a bleak landscape, with no clear path forward. I realized some secrets aren't meant to stay buried. They simply wait for the right moment to explode, leaving nothing but dust and regret in their wake. Helen begins the arduous task of compiling her financial records for discovery. The process makes the impending loss of her familiar life tangible and real. Mrs. Peterson reiterates the grim outlook, emphasizing Frank's strong evidence. The lawyer confirms the journals pose a significant threat to Helen's claims. Helen feels the escalating social isolation, marked by direct snubs and judging eyes. She endures a painful encounter with a former friend at the grocery store. Helen makes another desperate attempt to connect with Grace at the school. Grace's cold rejection leaves Helen more isolated and heartbroken. The terrifying thought of Frank questioning Grace's paternity resurfaces. Helen realizes this is her deepest fear, a weapon Frank now wields. She faces the stark reality of Frank's unwavering resolve and absolute contempt. The memory of their wedding day contrasts sharply with her current despair. Helen grapples with the understanding that her marriage is irrevocably broken. She begins to grieve the loss of her identity as Frank Miller's wife. The weeks that followed Frank's lawyer's letter were consumed by the grim reality of legal separation. Mrs. Peterson sent me a long list of documents to gather. Bank statements, investment portfolios, property deeds, tax returns going back 5 years. Sitting at Martha's kitchen table, surrounded by piles of paper, I began the arduous task. Each statement, each receipt, brought into sharp focus how deeply intertwined my life had been with Frank's, how every financial aspect of my existence was tied to the farm, to him. The thought of untangling it all felt like dismemberment. "It's a strong case for Mr. Miller, Helen," Mrs. Peterson had said during our second meeting, her voice flat. "The journals, the photograph, they paint a picture of deliberate deception. He has a paper trail proving his emotional distress." She didn't have to say it directly, but the message was clear. My past was an undeniable liability. The farm, our home, the life I had known was slipping away. The social isolation intensified. Elmwood Creek, small and tight-knit, thrived on gossip, and I was now the main course. At the grocery store, a woman I had known for 30 years, a fellow churchgoer, turned her cart abruptly down another aisle the moment she saw me. Later, Peggy Sue Jensen, usually quick with a saccharine smile, merely gave me a curt nod, her eyes cold. It was worse than open scorn. It was a deliberate erasure, a subtle turning away that said I no longer belonged. My attempts to contact Grace continued, all met with the same cold voicemail. One afternoon, driven by a desperate need to see her, to speak to her face to face, I drove to her school. I waited across the street, watching the students spill out at dismissal. When I saw her, her backpack slung over one shoulder, I called her name. "Grace!" She stopped, turning slowly. Her eyes, so much like Frank's, held no warmth, only a guarded distance. She didn't walk towards me. She simply stood there, waiting for me to approach. "Sweetheart," I started, my voice catching. "I just wanted to see you, talk to you." "There's nothing to talk about, Mom," she said, her voice low, emotionless. She looked past me, towards a group of her friends who were already watching. "Dad's going through a lot. He needs me." "And I don't?" The question escaped before I could stop it. She shook her head, a slight, almost imperceptible movement. "You made your choices," she said, then turned and walked away, rejoining her friends, leaving me standing alone on the sidewalk, the cold wind biting at my exposed skin. My heart ached, a deep, hollow pain. The terrifying thought that Frank might question Grace's paternity gnawed at me. It had been a fleeting, ugly thought before, but now, with Frank's ruthless determination, it felt like a real possibility. He was looking for every possible weapon, every way to prove I had deceived him, to invalidate our life. And if he did that, if he even hinted at it, I would lose Grace entirely. That was my deepest fear, the ultimate price. I sat in my car, staring at the school entrance long after all the children had gone. Frank's resolve was absolute. There was no going back, no softening his stance. The man I had married, the life we had built, was shattered beyond repair. He saw me not as his wife, but as a lie. I began to grieve not just the marriage, but the very identity I had worn for 32 years. Helen Miller, Frank's wife, was gone. Helen faces the finality of the legal proceedings and her impending financial loss. She accepts the cold distance from Grace, a permanent consequence of her past. The town's judgment hardens around her, marking her as an outcast. Helen understands the true depth of Frank's unyielding betrayal and hurt. She begins to envision a solitary, uncertain future, stripped of her old identity. The reality of her choices settles, leaving her with quiet, profound regret. Helen's life, once stable, is irrevocably altered by the past's eruption. She carries the indelible scars, facing her new path with a bleak acceptance. The future is a stark, empty canvas, painted by the cost of her secrets. The legal papers move through the courts with the slow, grinding inevitability of winter setting in. Mrs. Peterson outlined the settlement Frank was seeking, details that confirmed the complete loss of the farm, of the house, of the comfortable stability I had known for decades. Grace remained distant, her silence a constant, cutting reminder of her broken trust. The town, in its quiet way, had made its judgment clear, sealing me into a new identity, the woman who had deceived Frank Miller. I sat in Martha's kitchen, watching the snow fall outside, covering the fields in a clean, white shroud. My past, once a distant memory, now stood as a monument to my youthful foolishness, casting a long shadow over everything I had built. Frank's hurt was deep, unyielding. He would never forgive, and I understood, finally, that he had every right not to. The future stretched before me, a stark and empty canvas. There would be no more Helen Miller, Frank's wife, only Helen alone, with the quiet shame and profound regret of choices made long ago. The cost was everything, it seemed. My old life was gone, shattered by the eruption of a truth I had kept buried for far too long. All that was left was to learn how to live with the indelible marks of my past, to find a way forward, no matter how bleak. The legal proceedings confirmed what Helen already knew. The farm, the house, the life she had built with Frank for 32 years would be lost. Peterson explained the final details, the division of assets, the end of their shared financial world. Grace's silence remained, a stark, unbroken wall. The town, satisfied with its judgment, allowed Helen to exist on its periphery, a cautionary tale whispered in hushed tones. She accepted it all with a quiet resignation. Frank's betrayal had been profound, his hurt too deep to mend. There was no going back to the woman she had been, the wife she had pretended to be. The past had surfaced, demanding its full price. Helen would face the future alone, in a small apartment likely far from Elmwood Creek, a new life unburdened by secrets, but also stripped of the familiar. Her choices, once hidden, had now carved her new path. She looked at her empty hands, then out the window at the distant fields.